Now, I want to make sure you understand, when James is talking to these people, when the Holy Spirit told James, listen, this is what I want you to write, and guided him, that James is talking to rich rich unbelievers. Now, why do we think he's talking to rich unbelievers? Well, first of all, he doesn't call them brothers. And throughout James and other places, he calls them brothers. So he's talking to rich unbelievers in this book, in this chapter, beginning of this chapter. And what's interesting is he's using language that's reflective of what the prophets did in the Old Testament. You know, the prophets would come into the kingdom and into the king's presence a lot of times, and the prophet would just rail on them. This is what's happening, or he would tell them, this is what's wrong. You need to return to God. And that's why everybody hated the prophets. That's why they killed the prophets. It was because they didn't exactly give them good news. And James is not giving good news. Well, that's not necessarily true. Because if you read it correctly and you look at it, you'll see there is in there good news. I want to understand that this is not a condemnation against wealth. That is not what he is condemning. What he is condemning a wrong attitude about wealth. He's condemning it's a sinful use of wealth, probably the best way to put it. That is what he is talking about and talking against. Now, the thing is weird about this is, James has been talking to believers up to this point. He's talking to the church. My brothers, my brothers, my brothers. Then all of a sudden he throws in, you rich people. And you got to wonder, why is he doing this? Why is he putting this in here? And there's a couple reasons why. Well, first of all, one of the main reasons why is because you got to understand at that time that there were people who owned most of the land. They owned the land. And what they would do is they would hire people to work that land. And a lot of times they cheated their workers. And most of those people were probably in the church. So what he's doing, he's trying to show them, hey, this would be the good news part. That, hey, we know, God knows that you're being cheated. And that you're being treated badly. But have hope, because Christ is coming back and he's going to judge them, and you're going to get resolved. This issue is going to get completely resolved. So that was probably the first reason why it's possible that James puts this in there. The Holy Spirit convinced James or had James put this in here. He didn't have to convince him. He just did it. Another reason could be that within the church, there were people who were wealthy. And I think what God is saying is, he's saying, look, do not be like this if you're in the church and you have wealth. It's kind of like what the Old Testament prophets would do. The Old Testament prophets would come in and they would like rail against Assyria. Or they talk about the Syrians, or they talk about the northern kingdom. Then all of a sudden he would throw in there, but you, Judah, this is what you're doing wrong. Don't do what they did. So that's kind of, I think, what is happening here. It's showing us, if you have the means, if God has blessed you, then you are not to be like these people that James is talking to. And believe me, God has blessed some of us. And I think the problem we have in the church today, one of the problems we have in the church today, not just this church, but all churches, is we have a tendency to relate or to identify with the wealthy, right? We live in a society that is, quote, wealthy. Now, I know not all of us are what we consider wealthy, unless you compare it to the world. And then you start to see that, I think we are, even our poorest poor are wealthy. How many of the poorest poor have a vehicle, have a cell phone, have internet access in this country? When around the world there are people who don't have food and don't have water and don't have a roof over their head. And again, he's not condemning either one. I think we need to understand that the church has to make sure that we're focusing on the right thing.